We now have John Firth, who's wearing a number of hats here, I think, but we will give a perspective from the private sector itself, I think. What do you expect? And we're very glad that you could be here for the Standing Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to pick up, as Peter said, I'm going to relate back to some of the work that Jessica's done as well. So I'm wearing two hats. One is part of the Gary Working Group, which for some of you probably won't know about. It is the Global Adaptation, Resilience and Investment Working Group. I'm a member of that working group, but I'm also the CEO of a company called Acclimatize, which is an analytics and advisory business, and we only work in the climate resilience space. What Gary is something quite unique. It's a working group made up of a number of private sector investment companies, fund managers, corporate lawyers, insurance companies, plus some other stakeholders. It's entirely pro bono. There's no funds involved in this. It's self-funded. And it came out of some questions being asked by a fund manager on Wall Street in New York, who began to realize there was something called climate change. He appreciated the work that was going on in the mitigation renewables space, but he didn't understand what does this mean in the context of adaptation and resilience, and where might the investment angle be. So he contacted myself and a number of others, and we started to talk and explore about this, because the central issue was, how do I measure what is it I should look for in terms of a good investment in resilience? So he had that sort of mindset, because he wanted to set up a fund. So the idea of this working group came about. It was launched December 2015. It received very high profile with UN Secretary General. As I say, it's brought together over 200 public and private sector stakeholders. It was very interesting to be present at the working group. We meet about every 3 months in New York at the beginning of this year, when around the table, it was the first time I'd ever been to a meeting talking about climate change, and there wasn't a climate change scientist around the table. There wasn't anybody from a UN-related organisation, an NGO. This was all fund managers, banks, insurance companies, their analysts, all debating what was the issue that they should be addressing. And that's quite exciting, really. If we're talking about mobilising private sector finance, we have to get the Wall Streets of this world fully engaged in this. At COP22 last year, it released its first report, which is called Bridging the Adaptation Gap, which is freely available. It's a discussion paper and explored two key issues. One was, what is the approach to climate adaptation resilience risk? How do I appraise a project in terms of resilience? And secondly, how do I identify what the investment should be, which is, at the end of the day, what a fund manager wants to try and do. Some of the findings from that 2016 report are quite interesting, actually. There was quite a lot of survey work we undertook as well. What came out of it, and it illustrates some of the comments that were made yesterday, 78% of the Gary survey respondents ranked analysing the risks of physical effects of climate change as very important. Now, these are fund managers who are saying analysing the risks of climate change is important. That's quite a step change from what you might have heard from fund managers and banks 5, 10, 15 years ago. They would not have entertained this as an issue. And picking up some of the comments Jessica mentioned earlier, there are some very large players beginning to explore this space now. What was also identified was that, and there's a confusing element of it, there were a whole host of ranges of approaches, both to risk assessment and measurement, none of which actually spoke to how do I assess both the financial risk and the business opportunity from investment. What they were doing was addressing the environmental and social and impact risks relative to the debate that the climate change community world is focused on. So there were limitations on the current approach. There were issues about data consistency and coverage. We don't have the same data sets available for all the world. Scenario planning is difficult. We don't have good baseline MET data on which we can build scenarios, for example. And not all data is free and easily accessible. What was interesting, the criteria for success was 8 criteria were identified was, well, how do we develop a set of metrics? And the criteria involved transparency. Now, that's really important because it again, amplifies this comment that Jessica made. There is a movement in the financial service world to begin disclosure. Disclosure is an inflection point. The point at which businesses and financial services start to disclose is the point at which they do something. So transparency came out very strongly, and practicality. It's got to be something that's easily, but you can do and it's repeatable. Interesting enough, of the investor respondents, those who are actually investors, 70% said they were considering investments in this space now, and another 23% within 1 to 3 years. That's saying they are ready to move, but they're not quite ready yet. That's the important thing. And in terms of areas of greatest investment interest, and particularly relative to this conference, is infrastructure came top, 61%. Not least because it's actually an easy sector to understand for an investor. But also, they felt that investment in companies that address specific aspects of physical climate risk, whether they're technology companies, whether they're climate service companies, was also an interesting opportunity for them. So investing in the capacity and capability that other markets and other sectors will need in the future. The focus for Gary has moved on a little bit. So this is a pro bono, non-funded group, so it does have a limitation of what it can do. But in 2017, there are 2 elements, 2 reports coming out. One is Gary is releasing an investor guide to climate risk and resilience. It's only a short document. If you can't write down what climate change means on one sheet of paper, you're not going to capture the attention of a fund manager. So having big 200-page documents with lots of scientific analysis is not going to capture imagination. So you have to be very, very precise and concise. So a 10-page guide. It picks up the issues that Jessica's talked about in terms of the Task Force for Climate Disclosure, the US government on the French government on Article 173, explains current approaches and describes the practical questions and follow-up. And then there's a third report, which is coming, second report is coming out, which is developed by ourselves, 427 and Climate Finance Advisors, where we're actually taking one of the tables that is in the Task Force for Financial Disclosure and using that as a basis for trying to explain to a fund manager what are the real issues they should be exploring and examining in the context of climate risk, financial risk on infrastructure. The interesting thing is, if you look at any impact assessment type table or model that anybody would normally produce, the left-hand column starts with the hazard. It will start about change in precipitation, changes in snowfall, increasing temperatures. This doesn't. It starts with profit, turnover, cost, intangible assets, real assets, equity, debt. It starts with the issues that are relevant to that sector and then explains climate change in the context of those sectors. So we'll be releasing a report on that shortly. One of the outcomes of the work that's been going on, and I mentioned the fund manager, Jay Coe, who some of you may know, a group called the Lightsmith Group. His original objective was to set up a fund. That's moving forward now, something called CRAFT, Climate Resilience Adaptation Finance and Transfer Facility, a bit of a mouthful. It's the first dedicated private fund concept on climate resilience. It won the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance competition in 2016, which the World Bank's heavily involved in as well. It's now in mobilization stage. It's putting in $500 million of blended finance. A lot of that's coming from development banks. And they will invest in those 2 areas I talked before in a way. Companies that generate actionable data about climate change, and also companies that actually are delivering solutions. So it's investing in the corporate world that actually builds resilience. It also has a $20 million project preparation technical assistance facility, which is particularly aimed at developing projects. One of the big challenges we see continuously is you cannot pick up a national adaptation plan or an NDC and go straight to bankable projects. A lot of the time, what you see in a national adaptation plan, an NDC, is a good idea. and that's where it ends. It doesn't deliver it into a bankable project. And the amount of work that has to be done to turn it into a project is considerable. So that's partly what that's for. So my last slide, conclusions and next steps. I said earlier that the 2016 discussion paper and survey revealed a very high priority on climate risk metrics and high interest in investment. That has moved on. You know, the world is very quickly changing on this. And just generally on the interest of the private sector. The private sector doesn't actually talk too much about what it's doing. I came from the water sector, and in the very first climate models, GCMs, that were produced in the early 1990s, we were taking those and using that information to perturb our resource management models and actually looking at our long-term strategic plans and developing investment plans against them. In the 1995-97, we did a detailed risk assessment of the impacts of climate change on our business, and we realised it wasn't just about new capital investment. It was actually about how do we run our assets differently. It's about operational change. Now, a lot of companies have been doing that sort of work and quietly getting on with it without necessarily publishing it. One reason is because if you go to a company and say, what are you doing on adaptation? They'll say nothing, because it's not a word they use. If you ask them, what are you doing in terms of supply chain risk management, water management, resource management, customer changes, they'll tell you all sorts of things if you look for the correct keywords. So language is really important. We're beginning to see these dedicated investment vehicles, and I think the craft is just the first of a start of more vehicles. Once craft gets going, others are watching this, we'll see more. And this really is the way we start to mobilise private sector finance. There are other projects going along. There's something called the European Union H2020 project, EU Max, which we're involved in, which is a very specific project about exploring the needs of the financial services sector in terms of the data and information they need. And that work will come out very shortly as well. But what is clear is that we do need a lot more very practical and pragmatic coordination between the public and private sector on risk screening and on resilient investment opportunities. As I said earlier, producing NAPs and NDCs is not enough in order to mobilise the private sector. If you want to mobilise the private sector, you have to write the private sector into the NAP and NDC process. Most of the goods and services we consume and use and need come from the private sector, not the public sector. It's the private sector that contributes most towards the GDP of a country. If you haven't developed an investment plan that sits alongside your NAP or your NDC that is very focused on about mobilising private sector and effective use of public sector funding, you will not build resilience. It's quite clear that that's the challenge we have ahead. So that coordination level really needs to be changed and move forward. Thank you.
Yes, John, thank you very much. And I think that last comment is also is very important, and it goes very close to my heart. I've done a lot of research on the role of the private sector in building resilience. And yes, if you realize that in most countries, 80 to 90% of people are employed by the private sector, a large part of the economy is the private sector, and especially in developing countries, you need to reach out to them and make sure that they make resilient investments. And yeah, what we're discussing here is, of course, how can finance and investments and the financial system help with that?